extend a warm welcome to the executive designees that are here to represent their agencies. I also want to acknowledge the speakers, agency program designees that are here, and the public that are attending this meeting. And we want to acknowledge your effort in contributing each and every day towards the many climate-related initiatives that you all are working on throughout our state. Our last meeting was on January 22nd, a while ago. This council meeting was postponed due to the current COVID crisis, the resulting economic fallout, and the several weather-related events that our agency staff have been dealing with from the beginning of this year. We are going through unprecedented times in our modern history, from a public health crisis to economic uncertainty that lies ahead to the ongoing reality of climate crisis, all of which are having a disproportionate impact on the poorer households, the historically marginalized communities of color, younger Americans, and the elderly that are society's most vulnerable population. So as we work together to find solutions to live, work, and function in this new normal, let us acknowledge the inequity that remains and create an inclusive process that preserves our environment, our economy, and our way of life for our future generations. So today, you will hear about the statewide climate resilience plan that your agencies worked on. You will also hear about the work that has been completed and where we're headed in the coming years. One of these segments will focus on how we prepare for and become more resilient to extreme weather events and the changing climate. At this time, I will ask each of our executive designees to introduce themselves, and if you wish, provide any opening remarks or thoughts you'd like to make. I'll start with the governor's office with Jeremy Tarr.
Thank you, Sushma. Good morning, everybody. I'm Jeremy Tarr, Senior Advisor for Climate Change Policy in the North Carolina Governor's Office. Really appreciate Secretary Regan's leadership by chairing this council and the participation of all the cabinet agencies, not just in these climate council meetings, but in the hard work that's been going on despite the COVID pandemic, but in between meetings. And we've really made a lot of progress over the past couple of years. Excited to be able to share with you kind of the highlights of the resilience plan at today's meeting, in addition to some of the work that agencies have been doing since then to begin implementing it. So with that, thank you everybody online for joining, and I'll pass it to the next speaker.
Sure, I'll call on DOT Representative Joanna Reese.
Good morning, everybody. This is Joanna Reese with the Department of Transportation, and I'll just thank everybody for participating.
Welcome, Joanna. And next, Iris Cooper from DHHS.
Good morning, Iris Cooper here, Assistant Secretary for Procurement Contracts and Grants at DHHS. And Sushma, I can only second what you said is, so we're at day 208 of emergency operations in North Carolina. And as you can probably appreciate, working for the Department of Health and Human Services has been challenging for the last, I don't know how many months. Feels like Groundhog Day every day. But, you know, just like the climate impact and the disproportionate impact on historically marginalized populations, we're seeing the same thing, the same impact, disproportionate impact that COVID has had. So I think it takes all of our commitment to continue to fight what we can together and mitigate the climate impacts, because climate impact is a health impact. And we see that every day. So thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.
Thanks for those remarks, Iris. Next, we'll call for George Sherrill with the Department of Commerce. George, you're on mute, please. George, we're unable to hear you. I'll come back. Let me go with Reed Wilson with DNCR.
Good morning. I'm Reed Wilson, Chief Deputy Secretary of the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. Looking forward to the presentations and to the public comment as well. This is really important work and we are committed to making a difference on it. So thanks everyone for being a part of today's meeting.
Welcome, Reed. Next, we'll go to Mark Edwards with Department of Administration.
Good morning, Sushma and everyone. I'm Mark Edwards. I'm the Chief Deputy Secretary of the Department of Administration. Again, thank you for allowing us to participate with the Governor's Climate Change Interagency Council. We look forward to the presentations today and all the work going forward. So thank you.
Great. Good morning. Nate Denny from the Department of Information Technology.
Good morning, everyone. Nate Denny with Department of Information Technology. Just want to echo everybody's thanks and look forward to another productive discussion.
Great. How about Department of Revenue? Angela?
I'm Angela Altice from the Department of Revenue. I'm the Assistant Secretary of Business Services, and just like to say I look forward to continue working with the team. Thank you.
Welcome. From Department of Public Safety, Doug Holbrook.
Good morning, Sushma and everyone on the call. I'm Doug Holbrook. I'm the Chief Financial Officer of the Department of Public Safety. I have really appreciated all the things that I've learned being on this council and also the opportunity that I've had to work with my colleagues within our department at the Office of Recovery and Resiliency, particularly Marlena, whom you're going to be hearing a lot from later on. This process has really been highly educational for me, and I've really enjoyed that opportunity to work closely with them on resiliency.
Welcome, Doug. From DMVA, I believe Cecil Holt could not make it, but Paul Berry is in his place. Paul?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Yeah, Cecil's out with just a minor medical thing today, but I'm kind of his backup. I'm the installation coordinator for North Carolina Department of Military and Veterans Affairs. So my role in this is through the eyes of the military installations because they're federal, but I spent 30 years in the Marine Corps and have some decent experience with the installations, energy programs, and their climate resiliency programs, and how all this would complement the efforts, the great efforts that are taking place in North Carolina and how it supports Executive Order 80. Thank you.
Great. I'll go back to Department of Commerce with George. George, are you able to say hello?
I think I'm unmuted now, Sushma, so I apologize for that earlier. But yes, I'm George Sherrill. I'm the Chief of Staff at the North Carolina Department of Commerce. We are so appreciative to be able to participate in Executive Order 80. One of the exciting things that the Department of Commerce is undertaking to try to reduce the carbon impact on North Carolina is to view the opportunities for offshore wind. We have a study that's underway now to see how North Carolina can better participate in that. We're excited about it, and we hope that'll help the Climate Change Council meet the goals that it's established for a carbon impact in North Carolina in the future years. So thank you, Sushma.
Thank you, George. And I will call on, can't tell who's here from the Office of State Budget and Management. Is anyone here? Okay. How about OSHR? Okay. All right. Well, that is those are our executive designees, and just folks that are online. We have a whole bunch of folks that are supporting each cabinet executive agency designees. That includes program staff and leads that are working on a variety of Executive Order 80 initiatives. So Matthew, if you could forward to the next slide, please. Today's agenda consists of a report out on the Climate Risk Assessment and Resilience Plan. It is broken down into what is contained in the report itself. We've selected portions of the report that might be of most interest to the designees, as well as the public, to understand how those segments got put together and what our findings were. Then you will hear from the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resilience Chief Officer and her partners on the path forward for resilience as they begin to implement a variety of actions as outlined in the resilience plan. We'll take a 10-minute break after that, and then we'll open up for about 30 minutes of public engagement, where a few folks have signed up to provide comments to the designees as they proceed with the implementation of EU80. Next, please. Okay, we did that. Next, please. I'll just set the stage regarding the first segment of our agenda. As we already said, Section 9 of Executive Order 80 directed DEQ, along with state agencies, to prepare a climate risk assessment and resilience plan. This coordinated work started in April of 2019 and was completed in March of 2020. The plan was released in June, a little later than planned. That was due to the health crisis and all of the agencies being preoccupied with all the work that was going on. The plan itself is a combination of an intense effort by state and local governments, federal partners, community organizations, NGOs, and many other folks that contributed to its content. It is an evaluation of the current state of science related to climate change. It also contains an analysis of the impacts of climate change on agency assets, programs, and services. And it provides an initial resilience strategies that agencies have defined for their programs and their assets for reducing the risks that they identified for the key sectors of the economy. Today, you'll hear about the plan and the components checked here. Next, please. I will not go into this slide. You've seen it before in our previous council meetings. It's basically a 4-step process that we followed, starting with the climate science assessment to agencies conducting their own analysis. Just to highlight that this consisted of a variety of workshops led by our federal partners and experts from the university sector. And then at the end, we also conducted some listening sessions and community workshops throughout the state to hear the voices of concern and what we needed to consider in these plans. So I will pass this off to our speakers. Our first speaker, next please, Matthew. Our first speaker is Dr. Kathy Dello from the North Carolina Climate Office. And Kathy was one of the authors, and she will talk about the Climate Science Report's key findings. Welcome, Kathy.
Thanks, Sushma, and good morning, everybody, on this gorgeous fall day in North Carolina. I am going to cover 200 pages of a climate science report in 10 minutes. So really, the upshot is North Carolina is going to be hotter, wetter, and more humid in the future. I was one of the authors of this report and also on the Climate Science Advisory Panel. My day job is the state climatologist of North Carolina, and I'm also the director of the State Climate Office at NC State University. Really enjoyed working on this report with the many partners. All of these figures come from the report itself. Matthew, next. So since we have 10 minutes, I put the last slide first. This is really the take-home message that you need to know. As long as we keep relying on fossil fuels for our energy, there are big changes in store for North Carolina. We're in a different North Carolina than the one we knew, and this is a drastically different North Carolina by the end of the century. This means it's going to be hotter. The temperatures will be outside of anything that we've seen in our lived past. Disruptive sea level rise, which we're already seeing on our coast. Increases in intensity and frequency of extreme rainfall. If you've lived in North Carolina for the past 6 months, I can point out any number of 5-inch events that have either flooded your road or your basement, or in my case, my poor flowers. And we'll see more intense hurricanes. We bite our nails every hurricane season, every time we see something developing in the tropics, and hope that it doesn't hit North Carolina. But we all know that it just takes one. And then higher absolute humidity levels. These are those hot, sticky days. When you couple those with the temperature, you have a climate and you have a situation that poses a really big public health risk. But it also supercharges the atmosphere. And that's why we're seeing more of those extreme rainfall days and more precipitation associated with hurricanes. So we're seeing this in our backyard already. We're expecting more of this in the future, but really, truly, it depends on what actions we take to cut our carbon emissions. Next slide. So we've warmed about 1 degree Fahrenheit in the recent past. The globe has warmed about 2 degrees, so North Carolina is a little bit behind. And this is just a plot of historical temperatures. It was warmer in the 1930s. The Southeast as a region was cooler in the 60s and 70s, but we've sped up and we've caught up to some really accelerated warming. And to really put a point on it, 2019 was North Carolina's warmest year on record, which topped 1990. But the thing that's driving these temperatures, these average temperatures, isn't the hot days, even though we go outside and sometimes it seems unbearable. It's really the hot nights. The last 5 years have been North Carolina's warmest overnight temperatures on record. And when we talk about averages, 1 degree doesn't really sound like that much. If I told you today the temperature is going to be 70 degrees Fahrenheit and tomorrow it's going to be 71, you might say, well, big deal, Kathy. But we're talking about the background state. We're talking about all of those weather days going in and moving the needle toward an increasing average, which we see play out on our landscape, especially through those hot nights. Next slide, please. So that's the point that I was just making to kind of underscore this. This year has been relatively warm, and it's also being driven by overnight temperatures. We haven't hit 100 in the Raleigh area this year, but those very warm nights have just jumped out at us. And my office works a lot with extension and growers, and people are seeing the impacts of this. Fruit doesn't have the right amount of chilling hours. Or if you work outside and you're an outdoor laborer, you're still in those relatively hot days. It's North Carolina, but then you may go home and lack sufficient cooling and you have this really warm night, and that puts a lot of stress on your body. But in the future, both of these are going to change. We're going to see more hot days and also hot nights. Next slide. So we climate scientists are living on the planet we study, so we have to create a laboratory somewhere else. And we do that using climate models and computers. So what we can do with these climate models is envision a future for North Carolina based on 2 global scenarios. One in red is the planet continues to use fossil fuels in the way that it has. We keep burning fossil fuels. We don't transition much to renewables. We don't start to think about alternative sources of energy. The green scenario, which is RCP 4.5, is one where we do transition to more renewable sources of energy. We stop using as many fossil fuels. I need to underscore that this is not just North Carolina or the US, but the entire planet. Unfortunately, the atmosphere does not stop at boundaries. We're all a part of it. So what this is saying, what this model is telling us, is that until about mid-century, those 2 scenarios, one where the planet continues the behavior that it's been exhibiting, or one where we enact significant policy to reduce our fossil fuel use, the 2 scenarios don't diverge much by mid-century. So we've bought into a certain amount of warming here in North Carolina. We know North Carolina will continue to warm. I said 1 degree Fahrenheit has been our historical warming. So we're talking about a few degrees more on top of that. But it's after 2040 and 2050 when things really change. So if we were to enact significant policy to reduce our fossil fuel use, we can follow that green trajectory and limit the warming in North Carolina to maybe 4 or 5 degrees above the historical average. But if we don't, and we as the planet again, we could see a warming of 6 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century in North Carolina. That is a completely different state than the one we knew and the one we know now. Next slide, please. There's no trend in annual precipitation, but I mentioned extremes up front. There is an upward trend in extremes. It's driven by hurricanes. Certainly, we've had a number of those in the past 5 years. But also we're seeing big rain events from things like cutoff lows, which in wonky weather terms are these low pressures that just spin off and sit over us. We saw a couple of those this May. Or we get these large convective events that can dump 4, 5, 6 inches of rain in just a matter of hours. And when we start to think about what this means for management and planning, we're certainly worried about those extremes, and annual averages have limited utility for that. I do want to point out 2018, it was North Carolina's wettest year on record. Mount Mitchell set a new statewide precipitation record, partially driven by Florence, but also, again, we're just seeing more extreme rainfall in all sorts of varieties. Next slide. And I just wanted to point out that these extremes are going to get more extreme. So we're expecting that annual precipitation will increase, because when you add up those 5, 6, 7 inch rainfall events, you're going to get a bigger number at the end of the year. It's more humid. Like I said, we're supercharging the atmosphere with more moisture. And when you put those two things together, it's very likely that extreme precipitation frequency and intensity in North Carolina will increase. And the panel on the right just shows on the top figure the higher scenario. So that's the one that we saw in the red, where the planet continues its behavior as it has. And then the two lower scenarios. But the percent change in number of days is an increase almost everywhere, especially in the mountains, although we do see some areas that might see less. Next slide, please. And this is my last point. Hurricanes, we're all thinking about them. We're all worried about them. We've seen significant impacts from hurricanes in the past 5 years. They will be wetter because we are supercharging the atmosphere. They will be more intense because, again, we're supercharging the atmosphere, and the winds associated with them, I'm sorry, there's a fire truck going by right now, may also make them stronger. But we don't know if the number of hurricanes making landfall in North Carolina will change. I just showed the total number of tropical events. We've had, ups and downs over time. The early 2000s certainly sticks out, but like I said before, it just takes one hurricane to cause a lot of damage to North Carolina. And when that hurricane hits you and your house, it doesn't matter if 5 more happen that year. Last slide, please. That was an extremely quick overview of the climate science report. I know many of you have seen the presentation or have read the report or the plain language summary. Just a little plug for our office, for the North Carolina State Climate Office. I have a team of climate and weather experts, a ton of data, a weather network. We want to serve this council, so please don't be shy. You can always reach out, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Dello. I wanted to also acknowledge your help and your assistance throughout this whole process. We couldn't have done it without you. And also Dr. Kunkel and the entire science team that contributed to this effort. We actually have a reference document that will guide us for the near future. And I'm sure we'll be calling on you all in the coming years. So thank you for all that work that you put into it. And then next, we will actually go into the sector analysis. As you saw from the outline, we focused on 11 sectors. Today, you're going to hear from the Department of Health and Human Services, Lauren Thie, and the Department of Transportation, Colin Miller. Both of these individuals worked very hard to prepare that portion of the report, and we'll talk about how they integrated the analysis into their agency's work. So with that, I will pass the mic off to Lauren Thie. Lauren. Matthew, if you could pull up Lauren's slides, please.
Yeah, Lauren, would you like me to pull your slides up, or would you like to do it?
Either way, Matthew, and whatever version you have ready is going to be fine.
Okay. Let me stop sharing real quick.
Because I don't see an option for me to pull it up, unfortunately.
I can pass you the ball. You want to do that? Let's see.
I could start introducing myself till I see my slides. Thanks, Matthew, and everyone for the help. Oh, now I'm the presenter. Okay. And ta-da! Thanks, everyone, for your patience. Thank you, Matthew, for getting me set up. So I most frequently work with a group of experts at the Department of Health and Human Services. Iris, who introduced herself earlier, Ben Money, also, who unfortunately couldn't attend today, and Virginia Goodry, who's also here today, who's the branch head for occupational environmental epidemiology. So I manage the Climate and Health Program, which is funded by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention within the State Health Department. And then I also work with all these folks. As some of you may have noticed, we are in the middle of a global pandemic, and Virginia and I particularly have strong roots in epidemiology. And so really the last year since this report has come out is full of an unprecedented sort of activation of epidemiology, at least that I've seen, an unprecedented amount of health data being available on timescales that has previously not been available on, or levels of detail. And then also there's been, like, at this point, thousands of pages of guidance that epidemiologists have put together for basically, it seems like everybody in the state, although I'm sure there are populations still to be reached, certainly. And so in the midst of all that, there's also been all this things happening around climate change due to, the requirements of responding to the pandemic. Global climate change emissions have dropped. You may have seen that China recently made a huge commitment to reducing their earth warming air pollution. And really, I guess, so I think the story remains, that amidst these health impacts of climate change, there are these existing underlying inequities that Iris and Ben and Virginia and I talk about all the time, and other people across the state health department talk about and address all the time. And so I think this situation in some ways displays what we do on a regular basis, which is there are these ongoing pressing health issues, clearly at like an unprecedented level right now. But amidst all that, we have to figure out how to address climate change. And so I left my picture up here of the hog waste lagoons overflowing after Hurricane Matthew, because I think similarly, there are these kind of health disasters that go on, and amidst that, there's this climate and health work to do. And I really would leave our partners today who want to, support us in COVID or support addressing health impacts of climate change to say, that I think continuing to see how you can support us in our COVID work is really helpful. Continuing to see how you can support us in addressing underlying inequities that impact people's health. And I know many of you across these different state agencies work on public health, even though you're not in the division with us. So I'll just share a little bit about the key actions we've been doing in the last year. Amazingly, amidst the majority of us have been working all of our time plus overtime on COVID, Virginia and Iris and Ben and I for some time. But we have been able to do a bit. So we've completed a literature review for the pending climate change addendum to the Early Childhood Action Plan. So this is a major initiative from the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And there is an effort to make a report about basically where will be our children's health in 2050 and kind of under climate change. So putting together a literature review that will add more information to motivate our childhood health partners. We were able to, Virginia and Ben and I, publish a work in the North Carolina Medical Journal, just really making the connections between Executive Order 80 and health benefits, and that's been recently published, and the links on there. Our climate and health adaptation work, at least for my program in the health department, continues. So I just talked yesterday with some of the foresters we work with on wildland fire elementary education and adapting that to the virtual classroom and continuing to implement heat health alert systems and really thinking creatively with our partners who do those heat health alert systems about how they do their work safely during COVID and integrate it into work with COVID. And we've been spreading the word about not only our Executive Order 80 resilience planning work, but also just broadly in climate and health connections. And here's a few ways we've done that. I recently participated in like a North Carolina Museum of Life and Science evening webinar series that I'm assuming is kind of aimed at parents, but people across kind of the community joined. The South Regional Area Health Education Center. So there's regional area health education centers throughout the state that provide training for clinicians. So I recently joined them for a climate and health month-long series that they did for public health professionals, clinicians in Eastern and Southeastern North Carolina. And that also presented at the International Smoke Symposium, which is an international group of researchers that get together and present kind of the science about wildfire smoke exposure and impacts on health. So I did want to highlight, these are really from our chapter of the Risk and Resilience Plan, kind of the critical impacts we continue to see and feel in health and human services. We continue to respond to disasters as needed with a variety of public health services. The big one right now is COVID-19. We know that there are these potential options for addressing impacts, such as addressing existing toxic exposures that are in low-income communities, that are seen in Black communities and Latinx communities and the Indigenous communities in the state. And we still need additional support for some of the programs we have that directly help us respond to climate change and health impacts. And I really look at the bottom one right now, right? Infectious disease tracking and all the support we need around the pandemic. And this was, written ahead of COVID-19, but definitely is true this year. And then lastly, just I want to share a little bit about the progress we've made on proposed strategies from our chapter. And I think, we contributed to the reducing earth warming air pollution in part by trying to make through the medical journal the connections between the policies of reducing earth warming air pollution and health, continuing to work to reduce wildland fire smoke exposure to sensitive populations, working in Hope County. One impact of COVID-19 has increased the access to cooling, so people didn't have their energy cut off for a large amount of the summer as direct economic stimulus in response to COVID. But I've been wondering, some of these health gains we've been able to make during COVID, how can we work together with our partners to, in a more long-term way, support populations, and then also increasing social and behavioral health supports in vulnerable communities. There's much more work to be done in that area, but I think this year we've really seen kind of unprecedented societal support in response to COVID-19, in response to police brutality, about increasing social and behavioral health supports. And then, didn't mean to quite do that yet, but I did want to just flash up my information. So I'm funded by the CDC, thanks to our partners. And then there's my email address and phone number. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lauren. We'll move on to Colin Miller from DOT in the interest of time.
All right. Well, while Matthew's sorting that out, I'll introduce myself. Thanks, Sushma. My name's Colin Miller. I work with the Environmental Policy Unit at NCDOT. I've been part of the executive order, NCDOT's, one of NCDOT's technical lead with my colleague, Heather Hildebrandt, who I think is in the audience today. Yeah, we've been here on this committee since the beginning, and I'm glad to be here today to present some of the things that NCDOT has been doing since the writing of the Risk and Resilience Plan last year. Next slide, Matthew. So Chapter 5 of the Statewide Risk and Resilience Plan, the transportation part of it, 5J, we identified the climate stresses for North Carolina, and of course we based those on the Chapter 3 climate projections, the North Carolina specific climate projections that Dr. Dello and Dr. Kunkel and others had put together, and really was a great part of the report and an excellent resource for North Carolina moving forward. But for DOT, it really wasn't rocket science. We have a water problem at NCDOT. Our climate stresses are sea level rise, storm surge, sea level storm surge associated with hurricanes, flooding events, usually associated with hurricanes, but as Dr. Dello pointed out, not just hurricane rain events. And as we move west, even rock slides and slope stability problems that we have out west, they're also essentially flood related. But in the chapter, we identified not only our climate stresses, but our non-climate stresses, the development of North Carolina, land use changes. North Carolina is a growing state. And so as we convert unused or undeveloped land to developed land, that of course changes runoff. Again, runoff, water problems. Did I mention we might have flooding problems in North Carolina moving forward? We need to look at those. There are also the age of our assets, all our infrastructure, but our transportation infrastructure is aging in points. We need to look at that. And then we also looked at dam breach potential. Again, flooding events, dams, old dams, and the transportation assets that we have downstream of those areas. We looked at temperature increases and wind, but those are sort of minor stresses on transportation. We're really talking about water. So next slide, Matt. So following Hurricane Florence in 2018, DOT had already started some resilience studies specifically on I-40 and I-95 that were totally closed for at least a couple of days on I-40 and 7 or 8 days on I-95 near Lumberton. And we were already looking at the resilience of our major transportation routes. And so the feasibility study that we did specifically on those two routes has already come into use. We're looking at I-95 widening around Lumberton, and we're already seeing some of the results from this resilience study and using that in our specific designs for the I-95 widening project that goes through Lumberton, this area pictured at the bottom here, and over the Lumber River, which of course flooded. And so prior to the Risk and Resilience Plan, NCDOT was already working on some resilience work. Other things during Florence, the resilience work that we'd already been working on that was actually deployed during Florence, our statewide transportation operations folks had some real-time evacuation routing and traffic monitoring procedures that they put into place. And our Division of Aviation drone program, again, looking at these pictures to the left, offered us some real-time imagery that really helped us address the situation. Next slide, please. So some of the things that were already on DOT's in our radar already and moving forward, North Carolina's Emergency Management Fireman Program, the Flood Inundation Mapping and Alert Network. This is a network of 500 or 600 gauges across North Carolina that looks at stream and river stage heights during flooding events. And you can go online. It's a web-based program where you can actually look and predict at stream and river levels and look at their flooding effects, in the future, real time. We now have Feynman T, which is piggybacked up in this system. We've put in our road and bridge elevation data. And if you look carefully at the image on the left here, we can, again, use the sliding bar scale of Feynman to look at flood stages real time and in the future, and look at our roadway assets that might be in danger, and make the appropriate responses. There's another web-based monitoring platform, BridgeWatch, that's being deployed. This is more specific to bridges, of course, and it's looking at flood stages and bridge flooding, specifically looking at the scourability or the foundation risks during flood events. This is a relatively new program that we're just deploying this year. It's through a company called US Engineering Solutions, and we're adding now the data sources that we need: stream gauge data, and then NCDOT maintenance data on bridge foundations and bridge information. Because this is a real-time monitoring system, part of the work moving forward will be the workflows for monitoring bridges during floods, and the reaction if something may be pending, or if something's going to happen, bridge closures, road closures, that kind of thing. Next slide. March this year, we had we were awarded a NIFWIF grant. NIFWIF is such a great acronym. The Fish and Wildlife Federation. We got that grant with some matching DOT funds in partnership with the North Carolina Coastal Federation. We're looking at some resilient roadway solutions, some living shoreline solutions to protect about half a mile of road down on the coast in Swansboro, North Carolina. Work continues on that at the moment. As I said, the grant came in March 2020, so we're working with the Coastal Federation and tankered down with the North Carolina coastal management people, and we hope to be implementing that within the next couple of years. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah, go back. This is my horse before the cart slide. So all these projects that NCDOT has been working on resilient-wise are wonderful, but we're lacking the cohesive transportation policy, resilience policy that we need. And we've had to do that because we've had to react and move forward to address the individual weather events that we've already experienced. But what we need is something more cohesive moving forward. So at the moment, our cart's before the horse. Next slide. What we need to do is define what's vulnerable in our transportation assets. And so we have secured funding and we're scoped and ready to go with a vulnerability assessment of North Carolina's strategic transportation corridors, the major US and interstate routes across the state, some airports, 2 ports, and some rail lines. And we're all set to go when budget constraints due to the COVID crisis hit us. And so that's been put on hold for the moment, but what it has done is let us refine the scope even more and focus the scope even more. So I think within the next couple of months, those funds will be released and we'll be ready to hit the ground running. Next slide, please. So once we've assessed the vulnerability and we define our specific resilience criteria that are going to be applied to all the transportation assets, then we get to identify our improvements. And we want to do that in 3 main areas, looking at overall transportation policy. We want our long-range transportation and our work with the planning organizations, metropolitan and rural planning organizations across the state. We want their transportation needs. We need to know what makes their communities resilient, and the department will implement the projects, the resilient transportation projects that make those communities resilient. So that's going to trickle down into our individual project planning and design. And then Once we've done that, once the projects are in the ground, operations and maintenance. And that's one of the areas that we're strongest in at the moment. A lot of those resilient programs that I've just run through, the programs that are already up and running and moving forward, those are operation and maintenance and response programs. So we're in pretty good shape there. Next slide, please. And of course, we don't do this alone. One of the great things I think about the Executive Order 80 and the Climate Council here, all the people who are speaking today and people who are listening, are the partnerships that are developing. We're outside our government silos. We're working hand in hand with emergency management and the Office of North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency, DEQ, our federal partners at NOAA and the Corps of Engineers. We're fortunate in North Carolina to have a great academic community around us, the North Carolina Coastal Federation, our planning organizations. This is one of the great things about the Risk and Resilience Plan and the Climate Council is that we're not doing this alone, we're working together, and this is a cohesive statewide effort. So I look forward to updating you with DOT's work in the future, but that's all I have for today.
Thank you, Colin. Appreciate the overview. We'll move on to Amanda Martin from NCORE. Amanda is going to highlight the chapter on climate and environmental justice. Amanda led this effort along with a couple of our staff, and we appreciated all of her enthusiasm and contribution towards putting this together. Thank you, Amanda. Matthew, if you could pull up the slide.
Thank you. My name is Amanda Martin. I'm Deputy Chief Resilience Officer with the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency. And as Sushma explained, I'm going to walk through Chapter 4 of the Climate Risk Assessment and Resilience Plan, which is entitled Climate and Environmental Justice. So if you could move to the next slide. So this is an outline of what happens in the chapter, and I want to take a moment to thank the DEQ Secretary's Environmental Justice and Equity Advisory Board, specifically their Climate Change and Extreme Weather Subcommittee, which provided input on the content for this chapter. Next slide. So climate justice is an acknowledgement that climate change does not affect everyone equally. And we use this lens for this chapter as to understand an analysis of the deep inequities that are posed by climate change impacts. But I also wanted to acknowledge that this term is also used to characterize social and political movements that stress the need to address the needs of disadvantaged populations in both greenhouse gas mitigation and climate change adaptation. So sometimes you might see reference to climate justice movements. And clearly this is aligned with the type of analysis that we put forth in this chapter as well. And the chapter has a vision for North Carolina, which is one of a shared prosperity, a resilience that lifts all of us up. Because we can't be resilient with just some of our population or just some of our places. We know that it takes all of us together to bring the state to a more resilient place. Next slide. So the next section deals with inequity and climate vulnerability and resilience. Next slide. And there are a few reasons that we highlight for these inequities. Next slide, please. And this isn't an exclusive list, but I do want to touch on each of them. The first is social vulnerability, and this is the concept that there are social and political and economic factors that put pressures on certain populations that make them less able to cope with the impacts of climate change or make them more sensitive to climate impacts. And often we talk about social vulnerability in terms of race and ethnicity, and that's a very important component. But it also expands to areas like age or immigration status, or even the industries that you work in, or rural versus urban. Another source of climate change impact inequalities comes from unequal exposure to climate hazards. So the climate change that Dr. Dello talked about, it occurs in different places in our states to different degrees. So like sea level rise is hyperlocal, it's very much at our coast. And some of the geography of these climate change impacts overlaps with human and development geographies that have inequities built into them. So often we see this in inland flood risk, where we see concentrations of minority communities and low-income communities in inland floodplains. The next is infrastructure and housing disparities. And an example of this is that if you are in a precarious housing situation and your house gets flooded, you are much more likely to become homeless than someone who's in a secure housing situation and has their house flooded. And it's not to say that, flooding is a traumatic and terrible event, no matter who you are. But if you have secure housing to start out with, you're more likely to, again, be able to return to some type of secure housing in the future than if you start from a place of insecure housing. And finally, there are inequalities in resilience policy and programming. And this is something we're very aware of, and we think of a lot at NCORE. And there are a few different ways to look at this. A big piece of it is that we haven't seen a lot of federal leadership around climate change adaptation. And so it's largely been left up to smaller jurisdictions to take their own leadership and their own action on doing climate change resilience work. And that naturally favors larger jurisdictions, more resourced jurisdictions. So we see a big inequality in what kinds of places are able to take their own action on climate change resilience. But also in terms of the measures that we can offer on a property by property basis, at NCORE, we do buyouts, for example, to remove properties from the floodplain to reduce people's flood risk or exposure to flood. But those, by and large, are available to property owners, especially in owner-occupied housing, which leaves renters behind at a certain amount of risk. So there are a lot of ways in which our resilience policies and programs have these patterns that kind of reflect and in some ways can entrench inequalities that we already have. Next slide. The next section puts a spotlight on some climate justice issues in North Carolina. Next slide. I'm not going to go into depth into these issues, but I did want to mention each of them and encourage you all to read the chapter. The first issue is energy burden and heat. We have a number of households in the state, and they're concentrated in certain geographies of the state where energy costs are a significant part of their income. Often these are seniors on fixed incomes. And no one should be making a decision between heating or especially cooling their home and other household essentials like food or medicine. But in fact, we have that reality in North Carolina, and it's going to be exacerbated by higher heat due to climate change. We have workers in vulnerable industries. These tend to be outdoor industries, again, having to do with high heat exposure. Here you see a picture of agricultural workers. That, of course, is a big concern. But we have other outdoor industries as well. We have outdoor recreation, we have forestry. So those are workers that we're particularly concerned about. And of course, business owners in those industries as well, which may be impacted by climate change. There's the issue of African-American property ownership. And this has a very long history in the United States. Racial hierarchy has been reinforced through property ownership over many hundreds of years. And this has resulted in huge disparities in racial disparities in property ownership, and also in the wealth that's reflected in that property ownership. And so that both affects those kinds of resilience incentives or programs that are available to property owners. But it also, again, going back to NCORE's buyout program, property ownership may mean something different to a family that has property that has been handed down through generations, that was defended against attacks, that was very hard fought and hard won. So it may mean something different for that family to consider moving out of that property if it's in a floodplain than it might mean for somebody who's bought a new house in the last 5 years, and that has a racial contour to it. Finally, we have inequalities in insurance coverage in North Carolina. And this is so important because while we have recovery programs that are run out of multiple state agencies, we have FEMA, those programs will never be able to provide the kind of monetary compensation that good insurance can. And so that's one reason we see big inequalities in the level of recovery after, especially our big storms. Next slide. The final section of the chapter has some recommendations in it. I'm not going to hit all the recommendations, but I do want to highlight a few of them. Next slide. There are recommendations for cabinet agencies. There are recommendations for all branches of state government. There are recommendations that have to do with community voice and engagement. And then there are some research recommendations. Next slide. So there are 3 recommendations to the Climate Change Interagency Council specifically that I wanted to make sure to share. One is to develop an equitable public participation framework for all climate change mitigation and resilience efforts that state agencies and boards and commissions could use. The second is to design an interagency process to educate staff on the concepts that are essential to climate justice. And the third is to release a North Carolina climate justice report as part of future resilience plans and to ensure that that report has good opportunities for public involvement. Next slide. I want to pull out one of our state policy recommendations, which is to adopt a targeted universalism approach for resilience. And that means that we start in our policy by addressing the needs of those who are most vulnerable. And then we seek to improve the resilience of the entire state. So an example of targeted universalism is our nation's Social Security program. It was started by President Roosevelt to address elderly folks who are living in poverty, but it's available to everyone. So by starting by serving the needs of those who are most impacted by climate change, we actually can serve everyone. Next slide. We have some recommendations on community voice, which are to engage local voices, to engage new types of partners, especially those who are frequent points of contact in the lives of socially vulnerable people. And these are some non-traditional organizations and institutions in some ways for resilience work. And then to prioritize things like social networks, social agency, social capital, community agencies as critical components of building resilience. Next slide. This is my last slide. We also have a number of research recommendations. There are recommendations about how to do research, especially with communities, for communities and alongside communities that are impacted by climate change. And then we have a variety of topics that we recommend research on. And so for those of you who are attached to a university, take a look at these topics. We'd love to see more research that we can incorporate on climate justice in North Carolina. So thank you. That's the conclusion of the summary on the climate justice chapter.
Thank you, Amanda. Next, we will go to Misty Buchanan. Misty's going to talk about the Natural Working Lands chapter in the action plan that was developed by her team.
Good morning. Thank you to the Interagency Council for inviting me to speak to the group today about the Natural and Working Lands Plan. I enjoy working on this topic because natural and working lands offer solutions to many of the climate-related challenges we face. Nature has an amazing ability to heal itself. And in this landscape where we're working, it's easy to get overwhelmed by the magnitude of the problems that are associated with climate change. But our plan includes many examples of things anyone across North Carolina can do to help solve some of these problems. And that includes individuals, small businesses, and government programs. The plan has some small, simple things that will collectively make a big impact. And it has some medium-term recommendations, and then it has some large, complex ideas that will take many people working together over many years to achieve the desired effects. Next slide, please. So the group who developed the Natural and Working Lands Plan, our stakeholder group, came together primarily to talk about how we can store more carbon, how we can offset greenhouse gas emissions through carbon sequestration by using appropriate management and restoration of our natural and working lands. But along the way, we recognize that there are many benefits of the nature-based solutions that we are coming up with. And those benefits include things like economic opportunities for the fiber and wood producers of our state, as well as our farms and the rural workforce, helping communities develop long-term resilience, improving air, water, soil, and ecosystem quality, and of course, helping to improve and preserve the aesthetic beauty of our state for recreation, tourism, and helping preserve all the things that make North Carolina such a beautiful place for us all to live and work. Next slide, please. This slide shows the various components of the climate risk assessment and resilience plan, and you will find natural and working land solutions and recommendations sprinkled throughout the plan. We are found within the summary of key findings. There's also a chapter in the main report about nature-based solutions, but we really felt like we had so much more to say than we could include in one chapter. And so our group created a whole plan, and that can be found in Appendix B. And this is a large report that includes all of our recommendations. We've got 25 recommendations for action, but we also have a large number of recommendations for further research, education, and outreach, and quite a bit of information about the other economic and resilience benefits associated with each of our recommendations. So if you're interested in this topic, I do recommend that you take a look at Appendix B for more information. Next slide, please. Again, Chapter 6 is where you will find the nature-based solutions to resilience, and there's a pretty good summary and a little bit more of information about each of our 25 recommendations there in Chapter 6. Next slide, please. This slide was taken from North Carolina's greenhouse gas emissions inventory, which was developed by the Division of Air Quality with Paula Hemmer leading that. And it shows some of the main sources of greenhouse gas emissions for North Carolina. And you can see here electricity and transportation are two of our large sources, along with residential, commercial, industrial combustion, agriculture, waste management. And you can see in this particular year, the gross greenhouse gas emissions were 148 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in that particular year. Below the zero line in land use and forestry, you can see that our natural lands are actually pulling greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. And in this particular year, the greenhouse gas offset the emissions by 23%. So there's a tremendous opportunity here for our natural and working lands to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions or offset greenhouse gas emissions. And the goal of our plan is to help increase that offset amount so that our total emissions for the state will go down over time. Next slide, please. This slide shows on the left a pie chart that shows the land use across North Carolina. And you can see that 42% of our state is currently in forest condition. 20% is in agriculture, 15% in wetlands, 11% is developed, 8% is open water, and then the other category is 5%. Each one of these land use categories has the capacity to emit greenhouse gases or to sequester greenhouse gases, and some do both. But our mission for our natural and working lands plan is to help each of these land use categories sequester more carbon and store it. If you look specifically at the forest category, you can see that 85% of our state's forests are currently in private ownership, and 15% of our forests are in public ownership. This tells us that state government and federal government cannot do this alone. We really need to work with our private landowners to help identify ways that we can manage our land to help store carbon and to improve our resilience across the state. It also shows that the 15% of lands that are in public ownership are a really great place for us to provide leadership and to test new methods and develop recommendations that can be used on state lands and private lands. Another great opportunity for increasing our resilience can be found in our rivers and coastlines. We have almost 38,000 miles of rivers in North Carolina. And up and down each side of those rivers are places where we can grow trees, restore and protect wetlands, and those will increase, again, our resilience of the communities that are near those rivers. It will increase the communities of our ecosystems, and it will help us sequester, and store carbon and reduce the overall greenhouse gas emissions for the state. Next slide, please. This slide was put together by a member of the stakeholder working group that worked on this plan, Lydia Olander and Katie Warnell in the Duke University Nicholas School for Environmental Policy Solutions. And it shows some of the benefits for the economy of natural and working lands. You can see $91.8 billion contributed from agriculture, $1.1 billion from coastal tourism and recreation, $32.8 billion from forestry, and $188 million from fisheries in this particular year, contributing 20% of the total state product for that particular year. So natural and working lands create a number of benefits, not just for resilience, but also for our state's economy. So there's a lot of benefits here you can see from this plan. Next slide, please. This slide shows the stakeholders that came together to help develop our natural and working lands plan. We had about 100 people come to our very first meeting, and they represented some of the organizations shown here. There were even more who came and went and provided comments and provided editorial support. And we really see this group as a group that is working together. Now that we've got the plan, we're going to continue working together to develop ways that we can implement the recommendations that we have shown. Next slide, please. So when our group met, at the beginning, our main goal was to try to identify what were our guiding principles as we were developing our plan. So our guiding principles, the first one was to, as I said before, enhance carbon sequestration and mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. But we also recognize that along the way, we could build resilience in ecosystems and communities, provide public health and ecosystem co-benefits, create economic opportunities for agribusiness, recreation, and tourism, and ensure implementation is socially equitable. So these were our principles as we were identifying what we wanted to include in our plan. Next slide, please. So the stakeholder group divided into 6 committees who are going to work on different aspects of the land use categories in North Carolina. So we had a committee for forestry, floodplains and wetlands, precocians, coastal habitats, agriculture, and urban lands. So each of these land use categories is represented in our plan. But we do recognize that each of these categories isn't really necessarily a discrete unit. Many of these overlap with each other, and there are places where one recommendation will have multiple benefits for these different land use categories. Next slide, please. So out of these 6 categories and 6 committees, we developed a set of transformative recommendations, things that really don't apply to just one category or another of land use. And then we also have recommendations for each of the different categories of land use. So our transformative recommendations are shown here. The first one is to protect and restore forests and wetlands within flood-prone areas. And if you look at our plan, we have a lot more information analyzing what the collective benefits will be across our state and steps that we can take to protect and restore these forests and wetlands. The second recommendation is to facilitate voluntary landowner participation in carbon offset and ecosystem services markets. We recognize that there are barriers currently for landowners to participate in the marketplace that would potentially pay landowners to keep their farms and forests in a natural condition and to help store carbon in the natural landscape. And we believe that if there were programs, either a nonprofit or a government program, that could help landowners navigate the carbon marketplace, there could be more participation in our state, and that would provide economic benefits as well as resilience benefits. We also recommend developing a multi-state toolbox for natural and working land solutions so that we can work with our neighbors to help really help solve some of these regional issues. And then also integrating climate adaptation and resiliency strategies into local government comprehensive plans. So there's a bunch more information about these transformative recommendations, as I said in the report. Next slide, please. And I don't have time to go through all of our recommendations, but just one more example, and this is from the coastal habitat. So The recommendations in many cases are divided into identifying what we can do to protect what we have and identifying what we can do to restore what we've lost. And so in this case, we recommend providing incentives for coastal habitat protection. Also, facilitate migration of coastal habitats through protection of migration corridors. And in this case, we're recommending protecting the migration ability of the habitat itself, not just the animals and plants that are in that habitat. So that as sea level rises, we can predict where these marshes and swamps that line our estuaries and our coast may need to migrate to. And if we can protect and restore those places ahead of time, that will make the coastal communities more resilient, and it will also help protect our ability to store carbon in these types of habitats. We also recommend prioritizing climate change and sea level rise in coastal habitat and restoration planning. So these are just a few of the recommendations from our plan. I do recommend that if you're interested in this topic, please do check out Appendix B and, of course, Chapter 6 of the plan. Next slide, please. So as I said before, even though the stakeholder group who developed this plan has been working together at this point for about 2 years to develop and release the plan, we see this as a starting point for our action, and it's a real framework for us to work together. And we plan to keep working together as a stakeholder group to continue making progress towards these recommendations. So if anyone's interested in learning more about the Natural and Working Lands Plan or how you might participate in the stakeholder group, please reach out to me, and my contact information is shown here. Thank you.
Thank you, Misty, for your leadership and assistance in coordinating with this group. And please extend all of our sincere thank you and assistance throughout the last 2 years where this effort has really culminated into some solutions. We look forward to getting more updates through the council in the future. As we transition to the next segment, I just want to let the executive designees and their program office staff, as well as public that are on the call, that what you heard today is just a small fraction of what is contained in the resilience plan. There are deeper dives and sector-specific analysis that has been provided in the report. Specifically, the Department of Agriculture has contributed to an entire chapter on the impact of climate change on the agriculture and the forestry industry in North Carolina. There are sections on coastal resources, water and land resources, and then there's chapters on ecosystems, housing, buildings, and support services, and related to energy and public safety. So if there are any particular interests that any of you have, or how what you're doing meshes in with other parts of the state government's efforts, please work with your counterparts, and as needed, coordinate with us as needed to assist in that effort. So we are only 2 minutes beyond our schedule. So we will transition to part B of the agenda, and that is our path forward for resilience actions. And I will pass it to Dr. Jessica Whitehead to run that segment. Jess?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Sushma, for the introduction. And for this section, I do also want to preview an introduction of my team. Joining us will be Dr. Amanda Martin, who you've already heard from, and Marlena Byrne, JD. Both are my Deputy Chief Resilience Officers here within ANCOR. And then also going to hear from Tancred Miller, a close partner of ours in Division of Coastal Management, who we've been really excited to work with on already beginning to get some progress on carrying out some of the recommendations from Chapter 5. So you can have the next slide, please. I also want to step back here. I'm sure you've already seen this morning, and my apologies for joining late, but recognizing just how far we've come and where we've gotten to in this entire process in an incredibly short amount of time. As Chief Resilience Officer, there are a number of networks that we have with other states who have Chief Resilience Officers and who are or serving a similar function within their state. And North Carolina is really already becoming a model for other states. State of Maine has looked at what we're doing in particular as they're trying to produce their climate report on a similarly short timeline. And so I really just want to once again acknowledge and applaud everyone who's participated in this work to date and who will be joining us as we continue to move on this path forward. Because adaptation to climate change and building resilience is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And so producing the plan is not as important as continuing to make action as we move forward. So with that, the next slide provides what we see as our vision of resilience for the state. A lot of times you'll see a much briefer definition. We've actually looked very closely here at the state of Colorado and the way that Colorado really defines resilience and situates it in a concept of looking at the triple bottom line of not just our environment, but also our communities and our economies and the resilience of all of these systems together as we look forward and try to rebound from past disasters, adapt to future disasters, and really thrive amongst these changing conditions, both for ourselves and for future generations. The next slide, then I want to provide a little bit of the under the hood then of what went into Chapter 7 and establishing the path forward. A lot of you who are with the state and certainly members of the public know that before I came to NCORE, I was involved not only working on the ground in North Carolina, but with networks nationally of folks who are working on climate resilience planning throughout the United States. And so one of the things that we did as we considered how to frame the path forward was look at some of the research on what makes an effective plan. Because North Carolina is really about making sure that we are rather than seem. We want to not just create a plan, we want to be able to implement it and act on it. So looking at the foundations of places that have created resilience plans that are successful, we know that we need to think about the goals that we have for the future, defining strategies based on the excellent fact base that our science partners have provided us with, and the facts that our agency experts have provided us with. And then continuing to do things like we've seen in the Natural and Working Lands Group, where we are able to really facilitate this long-term public participation and coordination that's needed, begin to set up some implementation and monitoring so that we know, so that we have an idea of what success looks like and how we're going to get there, as we're also incorporating numerous uncertainties. So looking at other states and what has worked, both at the local level and at the state level, is what has led us to our path forward. And go forward on the next slide, please. We have 4 specific elements that we're really going to focus on. The number one is to continue updating and working on the state agency strategies. Our cabinet agencies and Department of Agriculture have put in an incredible amount of work to date. We want to make sure that we keep that momentum going and keep that progress. Whether you're an agency that has really had a lot of success and has already worked in this, or if you're an agency who's really thinking about this for the first time, meeting that agency where they are and tailoring to that. And Marlena Byrne is going to talk about that a little bit later. And then we have a couple of different levels of priorities of additional assessment that we know that we need to do, and one very, very specific implementation measure that we're going to pursue. The next slide is one of the 2 tables from Chapter 7 that sort of lays out these 4 concepts here and the different ways that the state is committed to updating these. Certainly, we're going to continue to follow the science and continue to update that as we receive new information. That can be as a large assessment, but that may also be, a number of times we've referred to this as a living document. So as we, as individual agencies need to do additional climate assessment as a means to accomplish climate resilient projects, we want to make sure that we're pulling these together. The state agencies, I've already mentioned those agency strategies a little bit as an annual update so that we can make sure that we are tracking progress and helping agencies where they need assistance. The statewide climate vulnerability assessment and resilience strategies, we've pieced this off as 2 particular priorities because there is a very specific tool that we have in our toolbox, the statewide enhanced hazard mitigation plan, that has a timeline set for the state by FEMA And so we know that this kind of work, like has been done in the Natural and Working Lands Group, we know needs to be done for these other big cross-sector challenges. We're going to need to piece some of those off that fit well into that hazard mitigation planning box. And then also some elements may not necessarily fit quite in what we usually think of as a hazard mitigation plan. So we want to be sure that we have those priority two, where we're providing more time for us to think about the best ways to address those. The next slide goes a little bit more into the next steps and participation that are needed. Again, we continue to see this as a collaborative process, and so highlighting that we will continue to partner with our federal agencies who have been of such assistance to us so far, and we know will continue to be assistance with us in the future, our university partners, our agency resilience staff, and then, continuing to say, how do we work with the local governments? How do we work with, the private sector and external contractors to make sure that we're pulling all of these together in a way that the state can act on? The next slide I want to go through is the guiding principles that we defined in Chapter 7. We know that it's a challenge, right, to define what climate resilience looks like from Murphy to Manio. And so stepping back and trying to think about what really applies no matter what your agency is, no matter what your place is, no matter what your biggest climate vulnerabilities are, includes looking very quickly and decisively. The things that are very clear that we know we need to do now, the lessons that we're carrying forward from Matthew, from Florence, from the landslides and the wildfires that we've already had, we need to take quick and decisive action to mitigate those risks. But then we also know that we need to continue to think very thoughtfully and collaboratively and make sure that we have equitable solutions for very, very challenging long-term climate issues. Disasters are an important part of climate change, but they're not the only long-term chronic hazard component of that. Thinking about changing patterns of extreme heat, long-term effects of that on drought and water supply, sea level rise. These are long-term issues that happen over decades, and we know they need long-term equitable solutions. Continuing our investment in safe, affordable, and connected communities. There's a lot of resilience that is not necessarily just about the climate piece or the environmental piece, but the social piece about where is our affordable housing, where are our employers, how are people connected, and how are they able to recover and adapt, and strengthening those regional economies accordingly so that we have the ability to adapt to climate change. Supporting healthy communities, and then that local identity and access to nature. As we thought about what we heard from the local governments, it's so important in our rural areas and in our urban areas that people live in North Carolina for a reason. They love the places that they live. They love the recreational access to North Carolina's resources that we continue to provide, whether we're in urban or rural settings. We want to make sure that we're plussing that up as much as we can in terms of support. And then really becoming a national exemplar of the development of and implementation of resilience best practices. The next slide is our cross-cutting resilience strategies. We know that not all of the hazards that we're thinking of and not all of the solutions that we're thinking of fit neatly into an individual agency's box or into the state versus local government box. So as we're thinking about those cross-sector challenges, how are we building resilience criteria into investments? How are we updating our plans, design standards, values, design values? How do we increase capacity, not just at the state agency level, but at the local level? Knowing that this is something where especially our rural local governments need help, need support to be able to continue to make progress. And identifying those sustainable funding sources for the future. And finally, increasing and improving our communication outreach and engagement. Continuing that conversation about what local governments need, what state agencies need, and what the solutions could be, so that we are capturing and developing those innovative solutions. So the next slide is our priority initiatives. So maintaining and coordinating that statewide resilience and convening a dedicated interagency team. Marlena is going to talk about that. Continuing the efforts through the North Carolina Climate Change Interagency Council. Just because we finished the initial products called for in the EO doesn't mean that any of them go away. We have to maintain and continue to improve upon those. So the Climate Council continuing to be a body that meets. This meeting is a proof of that. And then the last thing that I'm going to turn everything over for for Dr. Martin and Mr. Miller to talk about is the North Carolina Resilient Communities Program. We lay this out in the Chapter 7 as having several components. We know that we need to have some kind of online resilience clearinghouse and toolbox as a resource, not only for state agencies and helping us collaborate and use resources efficiently and leverage each other's efforts, but for local governments who may not be able to produce this information on their own. We need to be able to make sure that we're providing that information to local governments, making that accessible so that you can use it. We know, and we heard very strongly, that we need to have resilience training for local communities. A lot of people have heard the word resilience, but they don't know what it means in the context of their everyday work. And then the last and an absolutely critical portion is making sure that we're establishing some kind of grant program that provides technical assistance to these communities. A lot of times resilience does not necessarily fit neatly into the boxes of existing funding programs, especially when there's planning and capacity building that are needed first. So I'm going to go ahead and for time, I will skip the next slide, go on to my contact information, and I will turn it over to, I have far too many windows open on my computer, Dr. Martin and Mr. Miller to give an overview of the really exciting Resilient Communities program that we're able to announce today.
Thank you, Jess. This is Amanda Martin again, Deputy Chief Resilience Officer with the Office of Recovery and Resiliency. And I am excited to be co-presenting with Tancred Miller of the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality in their Division of Coastal Management. And we are going to be rolling out our Resilient Communities program today. Next slide. So the North Carolina Resilient Communities program, as Dr. Whitehead just shared, is one of 4 priority resilience initiatives that are called for in Chapter 7. Next slide. And the reason that this is so important is that communities and regions can solve tremendous resilience challenges. And there are a few reasons I want to stop and just take a moment on this concept, because I think if you walk away with one thing from this 10-minute presentation, I want it to be this. There are a few reasons that communities and regions are so important. On one hand, there are certain climate resilience issues that have a natural geography. For example, when we think about regions, we have watersheds and river basins, and economies function on a regional basis. At the same time, we also have strengths at the regional and local community scale. And these are things like local leaders and institutions and local cultural history. And these are the scaffolding on which we build resilience, meaningful resilience in our communities. And in particular, I want to highlight the role of local government in making land use decisions. And land use is probably the #1 mitigating factor for flood risk in North Carolina and in probably most of the United States. It's both something that can make flood risk, it can reduce risk and it can make it worse. Is there a place for water to go that is not your house? And as someone whose job is to wake up every day and advance the resilience of the state, I care very deeply about the ability of our communities to participate in our resilience work. Next slide, please. Luckily, our communities are very interested in doing resilience work, and some of them are on their way and others are interested and need more resources. So we heard through our workshops for developing this plan that community leaders and residents want access to expertise, they want technical support for analysis and planning, and maybe most of all, they want funding to implement those measures. Next slide. So the goals of the Resilient Communities program are to build local capacity, to provide technical assistance, and to supply funds to plan and implement resilience projects and programs. Next slide. To meet these goals, we have 3 components to our Resilient Communities program. We have a training and capacity building component, we have an online resilience portal, and we have funding for planning and implementation. Next slide. For training and capacity building, We see our audience as very broad here. It, of course, includes local, regional, and tribal government, but it also might include nonprofits and business partners who are going to be an important part of implementing resilience. And the content of these trainings includes resilience best practices, leadership, effective use of climate information, integrating resilience into our ongoing plans, policies, and projects, and other relevant content. Next slide. For the online resilience portal, we have a few goals here. Primarily, it's to empower leaders with the data and best practices that they need to identify solutions that are appropriate for their constituencies. We want to ensure equitable and easy access to climate data and resources, and to provide some consistency in the kinds of information that we're providing to different communities. The content for this portal will include free, relevant climate data, as well as best practices for building resilience. And we also see this as a home for key North Carolina resilience policy documents, like the plan itself. Next slide. Finally, funds for planning and implementation. And of course, the goal here is to motivate and enable implementation of communities' self-determined resilience needs. But I want to highlight the need for funding here. And there are really two elements of this. The first is that there are very few consistent sources of funding for aspects of resilience that are not construction projects. So this includes things like risk assessments, land use or comprehensive planning, outreach campaigns, business continuity training. Those are all critical pieces to resilience, but we don't have any programs that are dedicated to those elements of resilience. And then where we do have funding is often on the infrastructure side for construction, for moving dirt. That might mean levee maintenance or building gray infrastructure. It might mean floodplain restoration. But the big picture is that where we have federal funds for those kinds of resilience projects, they typically need a local match. And so communities that can't provide that local match are at a disadvantage for those kinds of funding opportunities. Next slide. So given those three components, we have a phased approach to this program. And because of the importance of this work, I'm excited to announce two simultaneous efforts, one being led by Division of Coastal Management and one being co-led by NCORE and the Rural Center, that have been funded by competitive national awards as well as by the State General Assembly. And I want to say, before we dig into what these activities are, I want to share that the geography you'll hear about in the remaining part of our presentation on the Resilient Communities Program is heavily focused on Eastern North Carolina. And that has to do with the funding opportunities that have been available, and also the mission of the Rural Center and the Division of Coastal Management having a particular geography. Please take this in no way to mean that we are exclusively, especially at NCORE, focused on Eastern North Carolina. We care very much about what happens in the Piedmont, what happens in the mountains, what happens in our cities. And we are eager to pursue any and all resources to roll out this project across the rest of the state. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Tancred Miller, who's going to present on the activities that he is leading, and then we'll come back and I'll present on the activities that NCORE and the Rural Center are leading.
Thank you, Amanda, and good morning, everyone. It's good to be with you this morning, and I'm very excited to talk about the Resilient Coastal Communities Program. Before I do that, I just want to acknowledge the great partnership with NCORE, the great support we've had from the Governor's Office and a number of partners across the state. It's been really a fantastic time to be working on resilience in North Carolina. We at the Division of Coastal Management, we've been doing this type of work for, I guess you could say, since we've been around. We are the state's coastal zone management agency. In that role, we serve as the coordinating agency between the federal government, the state government, local governments, as well as our partners, be that the private sector, NGOs, academia, etc. And we have a really robust program with a very small staff, relatively speaking. We have three major parts to our program. One is regulatory, so we do permitting for coastal development. We also do planning and policy development. We assist land use, local governments with land use planning efforts. And then we have our reserve program, which is responsible for stewardship education in our coastal reserve sites along the coast. When we do things like rural development or development permitting, we're always looking at balancing the needs of the environment with the rights of people to use their property, to recreate, to access the public trust resources of the state. And so we have built into our programs ways that we can protect those properties when people do develop, protect those resources, and help local governments to look forward to what's coming in their communities and how can they protect both their residents as well as their resources and their assets, economic assets. The Resilient Coastal Communities program really builds upon these years of work that we've been doing in the coastal communities. And more specifically, in the last, I'd say, 12 or so years, where we've been looking at climate change as a specific stressor to coastal communities. We've been doing work on sea level rise, looking at what are the impacts of sea level rise on North Carolina's communities, specifically not just the global rates or the national rates, but what are the specific rates of sea level rise for North Carolina? How is that impacting our communities, and will it in the future? We're looking at storm surges, we're looking at flooding, we're looking at all these different types of impacts and trying to assist local governments with the data, with the tools and resources to make themselves better prepared and more resilient. So we're very excited to have at this time the opportunity to advance that work with this brand new Resilient Coastal Communities program. And if you go to the next slide, please. This is a partnership between not just DCM and NCORE. We also have North Carolina Sea Grant, the Nature Conservancy. We're very grateful to the funding we have from the State General Assembly and from NIFWIF to provide these funds that Amanda was just talking about, to do the planning, to get to where communities have these shovel-ready projects and they can apply for and compete for these national resources that are often available for specifically moving dirt and making doing implementation projects. From the state's Disaster Recovery Act of 2019, we got a little over $800,000. This was earmarked for planning specifically in the coastal zone. And then we got an award we've identified, well, we'll be identifying up to 20 local governments to help them go through a process of risk and vulnerability assessment. And this is not just for their infrastructure and their assets, but also for their people. We're very focused on looking at vulnerable populations. And as Amanda mentioned earlier in her first talk, where are the opportunities and the need to identify these communities that are at particular risk and lower resourced and help them to find their way through, navigate their way through the challenges, understanding the risks, understanding their options, and then doing something to make put themselves in a better position. Next slide, please. Our three main objectives of this program, as I said, is to assist communities. Although we do regulation, we see this as ourselves as being a supportive role in coastal resilience. Obviously, the coastal zone is on the front lines for a lot of these big events, these big storms and hurricanes. We see a lot of flooding from these events year after year. But we don't want to be in a position of mandating at this point. We think decisions have to be done at the local level, made at the local level. So how can we provide that support, both on the technical side as well as on the financial side? We will be providing funding to these local governments to develop these prioritized projects in conjunction with their community, with their population, to get to shovel-ready status. Then we want to help them identify and link and connect to funding, primarily the national funding streams that are available for implementation. As Amanda mentioned, there is still a big hurdle to overcome in identifying the match or securing the match for some of these projects. We're happy for our project here. We do not have any match requirements for local government, so this is money that's going out the door to help communities with a very low burden of participation for them. Next slide, please. My final slide, just to give you all a sense of the timeline. We got the funds from NIFWIF just about 2 months ago, 2 or 3 months ago. So we're on a pretty aggressive timeline to get these funds out the door and help these local governments to implement these projects. At the end of this month, I guess we're in October, at the end of this month, we'll have requests for proposals from for the communities to participate, as well as for the consultants. And we'll be matching up consultants with communities to help them navigate through the first phases of this project. The first phases are the vulnerability assessment, the risk assessment, community engagement, identifying projects, and then prioritizing those projects. And so we'll have all that work done by the end of calendar year 2021. The third phase of this program is going to be providing funds again from DCM to do the engineering and design of these projects, the ones that they've identified with their communities as the priorities. So once that engineering and design is done, then they will be at that shovel-ready status and they can move forward to implementation. For us in this program, we have a little bit of the funding is earmarked for construction, which is our phase 4, and that'll be probably calendar year 2022. We are extremely humbled and we're extremely grateful for the incredible interest we've seen in this program. We are building this from the ground up, but we've seen tremendous support from a number of partners that have acknowledged and many that have not acknowledged at this point. And I just want to say thank you for that support, and thank you for your engagement with this process. It's incredibly important, and we are committed to doing the best job we can going forward. With that, I'll turn it back over to Amanda.
Thanks, Tancred. I'm going to talk briefly about the activities that we are leading at NCORE with the Rural Center. And if you want more information, please feel free to send me an email or give us a call. We'd love to share more information than we have time to share. So this is an effort that is supported by the Economic Development Administration through their disaster supplemental program for Hurricanes Florence and Michael. And it's a project that we are partnering with the North Carolina Rural Center on. Next slide. It has 2 chunks to it that build on one another. The first has to do with capacity building. The Rural Center is leading their very successful Homegrown Leaders training in Eastern North Carolina. And a quick shout out if you are or know a community leader in one of those 7 orange counties on the map on the screen and you want to apply, they're currently accepting applications for that region. There's also going to be a resilience webinar series that is launching this month. It's a fantastic lineup of speakers. I encourage you to check it out. The Rural Center is also organizing that. And as part of this effort, we're going to be developing a statewide resource, which is a local and regional resilience guidebook to provide consistent support to communities and regions that want to do resilience on how to do it, where there are sources of data, what kinds of processes, what kinds of outcomes, what are other people in North Carolina doing. Next slide. And then the second chunk is something we're really excited about. It's a process for regions to work together to develop a portfolio of resilience projects. And we have a whole process lined out about how we're going to do that. But the end product will be this portfolio of priority projects for regions in Eastern North Carolina. And this has become because often we see grant opportunities become available and we all scramble to try to find projects that fit the grant opportunities. And what we know is we need to flip that process on its end. We need to identify our priority projects first and then find the grant opportunities that they fit into or go out and pursue funding for them. So this portfolio process will be an opportunity to do that. So with that, I will turn it over to, I believe, Marlena Byrne is next.
I had to unmute myself. Hi, I'm Marlena Byrne, also of the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency. I am the other Deputy Chief Resilience Officer, and I think I have exactly 1 minute to do my presentation. So I'm going to try to move through this fairly quickly. Next slide, please. So this is actually the section where we talk about what the state agencies are called for to do next under the 2020 plan. There are two key components of this. One is that going forward, state agencies will be doing a yearly state agency strategy report. The other one is the rollout of the North Carolina Interagency Resilience Team. Both of these are initiatives called for under the 2020 plan, and I'm going to give you a little detail about both of them. But if you'd like to read more about them, there's more in Chapter 7 of the plan, and also we have some internal guidance coming forward for the agencies. Next slide, please. So the state agency strategy reports are something I do want to hit on briefly because the first one will be due on March 1st of 2020. As I mentioned, they're an annual report, and there's really no one size fits all for these. They're very much intended to build over time and to reflect each agency's needs and resources. Next slide, please. The key component here is that they're intended to build on what was already done in the 2020 Resilience Plan. As you know, the 2020 Resilience Plan took a sector-based approach, meaning it looked at agriculture and forestry as a sector, and not specifically, and not only, I should say, at the Department of Agriculture. And similarly did that with looking at issues around housing, public safety. So that was how, in the 2020 plan, we analyzed climate hazards and vulnerabilities and identified agency strategies for addressing the risks posed by climate change. Those efforts in Chapter 5 of the Resilience Plan were led by various agencies, but they really did this sector-based approach. Next slide, please. The difference between the 2020 plan's Chapter 5 approach and the reports is that the reports are really intended to describe the work of the agency to increase resiliency, focusing on agency plans, policies, procedures and regulations, and programs and projects, including capital projects. I do want to say, though, that each agency will have a valuable perspective on its sector, even in areas where it might not have direct regulatory, programmatic, or proprietary authority. And so because of that, we do want, where possible, these strategies to highlight that. Next slide, please. So these reports, these annual reports, are truly intended to be a report out on the agency's resilience work, not the work product itself. They need to identify priorities, next steps, and actionable items coming forward. And that is really going to depend on where these agencies are right now. As I mentioned before, these are intended to build 1 year after the next on each other. So we've got a wide variety of state agencies, some of which have been working on resilience planning for several years now, some of which are really just starting to dive into this work more intensely, starting with the 2020 plan. So it could be that the next steps are calling for more research and analysis to identify agency vulnerabilities, and to understand those issues better before you actually start rolling out projects. Other agencies may well be on their way to developing specific programs and capital projects to address climate change and climate resilience. Next slide, please. So one of the ways that we're providing, and by we, I mean the resilience team of the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency, one of the ways that we're providing guidance on these interagency resilience strategies is through the Interagency Resilience Team. This also is an initiative that was called for under the 2020 plan. And it is convened by the Chief Resilience Officer and her team. I'm actually been leading the charge on organizing this for our team. And it's comprised of a staff lead from each agency. And the idea is that this is really going to be a working group of staff experts who have the authority, capacity, and expertise to collaborate on resilience issues. Although our office is convening this team, we aren't leading it in the traditional sense. This really is intended to be a very collaborative working group. Next slide, please. So it's designed to provide a structure for tackling interagency resilience issues. It's also supposed to support the development and release of any updates to the plan, including the state agency resilience reports. We actually had our first meeting a couple weeks ago on September 18th. And during that meeting, the main agenda item was our team providing some initial guidance on developing these state agency resilience reports. You know, we're very aware that because of delays related to the coronavirus, that you know, we only have about 5 months now to roll out and develop these plans, or rather these reports, they're not plans, by March 1st. And so our team wants to be available and work with all the state agencies on developing those reports going forward. This is going to be a learning process. It's the first time we're doing it. But I did want to mention that our team is going to be providing additional guidance, and we're happy to also be meeting one-on-one with various state agencies. Next slide, please. And to that end, here's my contact information for anyone from the state agencies who'd like to reach out. I've already had some conversations with some of you about these reports. As I mentioned, we presented on them and discussed them at the Interagency Resilience Team meeting just a couple weeks ago. So thank you very much. Hopefully I didn't cut too much into our break. Turn it back to Sushma.
Thanks, Marlena. Okay, so we are 5 minutes from break. I just wanted to acknowledge all the work that went into the resilience plan. We don't have time to recognize everyone, but particularly Ned Gardner from NOAA's office in North Carolina Institute for Climate Studies, as well as Jim Fox and his team over at ASU and NEMAC. I know I left many people out, but it is not intended, but I would recommend folks, you know, go to these experts. They have really stepped up to provide a lot of resource to the state. I'm going to wrap up a few things before we go into the public session, and Jeremy would like to say a few things. But before we move on, just want to remind to the executive designees and their teams that the 2020 interim report, you all received an email from us that provides instructions for what we need. We tried to streamline this time. Hope that it's not too much work, but it allows you to highlight your last year's activities related to EO80. Please submit this to our agency by October 19th. The second is we're working on a compilation of your building's energy consumption report. This is due in September, but the report itself will be delivered to the governor on the status of the energy reductions from state buildings. The third, please continue to post your agency activities on the dedicated website that we provided for each agency to put their content in. And then finally, today's slides will be posted at the designated Interagency Council website. And we're tentatively looking for a next council meeting on December 3rd. And we hope to perhaps bring the mitigation activities and emission reduction updates at that time and allow more dialogue and conversation with the partners. So with that, I will pass the ball off to Jeremy, and then we'll adjourn for a few minutes.
Thanks, Sushma. I just wanted to reiterate a point you made right at the end there, that while you've heard today about a lot of the substantive progress we're making on resilience, we continue to work on the mitigation side as well. We continue to implement aspects of Executive Order 80 to get the greenhouse gas emission reductions that we need in order to achieve the governor's goal of 40% reduction in those emissions by 2025. So we haven't forgotten about that side of the coin. We continue to implement the Clean Energy Plan through, evaluating potential greenhouse gas reduction policies and opportunities to modernize regulatory incentives and structures in our power sector. We continue to implement the North Carolina Zero Emission Vehicle Plan, which focuses on light-duty vehicles and medium-duty vehicles. We continue to transition the state motor fleet, and the Department of Commerce continues to work to secure economic opportunities that we've identified and continue to present in North Carolina as we transition to a clean energy economy. And of course, each of those efforts are underway with a focus on equity. So we'll provide, Sushma said, updates on those in future meetings. But for now, I just wanted to remind everyone that we're continuing to move forward both on the mitigation and resilience side of addressing climate change.
Thanks, Jeremy. So I would request that the next segment is related to public comments, and several folks have signed up to make remarks. Sharon Martin will lead that effort. We'll take a 5-minute break, if that's okay, and convene back at 12:05.
All right, if everyone is ready, we'd like to begin the public engagement section of the Climate Council meeting. I'll ask the designees to turn their cameras back on. And if where possible, we've tried to make the folks who have signed up for comment panelists, so you should be able to turn on your video if you so choose. I will call each person and then the person who is next. If you are on the phone, when I call your name, if you will press *3 to raise your hand when I call your name, that'll help us find you and unmute your line. Everyone will have 2 minutes to give their comments. Our first person is Joel Porter, followed by Belinda Joyner. Joel? Mr. Porter, are you there? Joel Porter, are you able to unmute yourself?
Sorry, yeah, I actually didn't sign up to provide comment today.
Oh, okay. Well, then we will move on. Thank you. Belinda Joyner. Belinda Joyner. And if you're on the phone, please press *3 so we can recognize your line. I am not seeing you. So we will move on and I'll come back to you. Madeline Parker. Madeline Parker, followed by David Petrie.
Hi, this is Madeline. I also did not sign up to speak, so you can move past me. Thanks.
All right, thank you. David Petrie.
Yes, my name is Dave Petrie, and I am the director. I'm a director for the Southeast chapter of E2 and a member of the board of directors for the North Carolina Outdoor Recreation Coalition. Just for everyone's knowledge, E2 is a national nonpartisan group of business owners, investors, and other professionals who advocate for policies that are good for our economy and good for our environment. And the NCOREC is a nonprofit trade association advocating for the North Carolina's $28 billion outdoor recreation economy. I moderated a panel discussion during E2's Clean Economy Summit in August on climate resiliency in the outdoor recreation industry. Councilmember Reed Wilson participated in that conversation. I'd like to share with you a couple of key takeaways from that discussion. The first was the Great American Outdoors Act was enacted into law this summer. Its passage fully and permanently funded the Land and Water Conservation Fund, as well as provided guaranteed funding to address the maintenance backlog in our federal public lands. As a result, I hope the council acknowledges opportunity and moves to prioritize nature-based solutions, in particular the protection and restoration of forest lands. With the state's various public land trusts and partnerships with the National Park and Forest Services, North Carolina can take a very impactful step towards building resiliency. The state should work with these partners to fully employ these new financial resources in protecting and restoring our forest public lands. Not only will this enhance the carbon capture capability, but strengthen our state's outdoor recreation infrastructure. Second issue is related to climate and environmental justice. One key concern that came from that discussion in August was the disadvantage that many climate frontline communities have in seeking grant and other funding to improve resiliency. I note that one of the council's recommendations is to seek equitable public participation framework Nevertheless, historically, these underserved areas have not been able to improve their communities because they lack the same resources and more advantaged localities do in order to apply for and advocate grant funding. It's not that these communities do not desire access to these funds or resources, they just lack the support needed to research, apply, and pursue funding. Many of these opportunities require proposals and applications that can be onerous and require expertise that may not be accessible to or available. So it's hopeful that any framework the council develops recognizes disparity and the priority to be placed on making these processes both equitable and non-burdensome. And finally,
your time is up.
Okay.
Thank you. Andrea Santorum Geller, are you on the line? Followed by Adam Collette. Andrea Santorum Geller. All right, not hearing her. So Adam Collette.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
I can, thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for your time. My name is Adam Collette. I'm the program director for Dogwood Alliance. This plan is absolutely a great start, and we acknowledge the months of hard work that went into it. Pledging to protect and restore a total of 2 million acres of forests and wetlands points us 100% in the right direction. We know how difficult it is to pull plans like this together and commend all on the process and NCDEQ for including us, Dogwood Alliance, in the natural working lands process. We hope to continue that. We all know that we can't solve the climate crisis without forests and land, but forests and land can't be a part of the solution if we keep doing things the same way we've been doing them. They can't be part of the solution until we start to fully acknowledge the impacts of industrial logging on the resilience of our forests and our communities from climate events like flooding and hurricanes, as well as environmental justice. Only around 10% of lands deemed protected in North Carolina are actually protected from most clear-cut or industrial logging. Why is this the case? It's because our agencies and inventories do not acknowledge these impacts of industrial logging. For example, when a forest is clear-cut, completely gone, it's still counted on paper, the stats you see, as acres of forest land here in NC. And generally, we don't count any of the carbon emitted from that clear-cut. When these emissions are accurately accounted for, forestry becomes the third largest carbon contributor to our state's carbon emissions. So quickly, the plan's admirable call for 2 million acres protected or restored gets put into a dimmer perspective, as well as the state's GHG inventory. With over 200,000 acres of North Carolina forest clear-cut every single year just for export, 60,000 of those acres being from new biomass demand that's being burnt in Europe. If these efforts allow for business as usual or even increases in states' logging rates, then we will continue to see a decline in the ability of North Carolina forests to protect our communities and climate. And we hope that the continued process with the natural and working lands plans avoids these pitfalls. I know that it can. Within this plan, we have the opportunity to truly lead the nation. But unless we're truthful about our starting point with forests and accurately acknowledge the impacts of industrial logging, our efforts moving forward are not going to have the desired effect. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Mac Ledgerton, followed by Avery Lamb. Mac Ledgerton, are you online?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Please go ahead, sir.
Yes, I'm very encouraged by the new programs that the council is putting together and offering. The challenge is one of the barriers in our environmental justice communities is the gap between our local governments, the town councils and the county commissioners, and the most impacted residents and communities. And the challenge is engaging our impacted residents and communities in engaging them at the table for climate recovery, disaster recovery work as equal partners. The state's approach, as we all know, is pretty top down, using experts to work with our local governments. And our local residents are really not at the table. And particularly, we're beginning buyout programs when people have been out of their homes for 2 to 4 years. They don't see any future in their communities, and they haven't been involved in revisiting and redeveloping their communities. So this is the challenge with these new programs, to figure out a way to involve the nonprofit sector, the grassroots organizations, and really engage them and our local residents that are most impacted in the new planning processes that you hope to initiate. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Avery Lamb, followed by Susan Holbert.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. My name is Avery Lamb. I'm here representing Creation Justice Ministries, North Carolina Interfaith Power and Light, and the Southeast Faith Leaders Network. I'm also a student at Duke Divinity School and the Nicholas School of the Environment. And I want to share today about the unique role faith communities can play in the implementation of this excellent resilience plan. Hundreds of coastal faith communities are at risk of sea level rise flooding and increased hurricane risk. And we've already seen these effects in many communities along the coast, which have been flooded multiple times at great risk to the services they provide in their communities. For many areas of the coast, houses of worship are the primary social organizers of a town or a community. They are already hubs of social, physical, and spiritual resilience. And it's important to recognize these communities also as critical hubs of climate resilience. With partnership and investment at the state and local level, coastal faith communities can leverage these social, physical, and natural capital to become hubs of climate resilience in their communities, helping vulnerable North Carolinians weather the physical and the psychological trauma of climate change. There's already profound interest in climate resilience among faith communities. In August, we hosted a Faith Communities and Climate Resilience Summit to connect hundreds of faith leaders with technical, political, and environmental leaders. What we found is that as trusted messengers, faith communities and leaders are a key intermediary between government and individuals and families. The entry point for community outreach is often through that community's faith community. Creation Justice Ministries, North Carolina Interfaith Power and Light, and the Southeast Faith Leaders Network are working as liaisons between local faith communities and state and federal agencies, but this work needs buy-in and investment. We're excited to work with all of your agencies, particularly the Resilient Communities Program, to build resilience in these towns and cities. And I hope that the agencies represented here today will look to faith communities as key partners in community-level implementation of this plan and prioritize investment in the burgeoning faith-based resilience work. Thanks.
Thank you. Susan Holbert, followed by Terry Lansdell. Susan Holbert, are you on the line? And a reminder. We'll go on to Terry Lansdell.
Thank you. Good afternoon. And thank you to the governor and members of the ICC. I'm Terry Lansdell. I serve on the Air Quality Commission for Mecklenburg County, and I serve as a director for Bike Walk North Carolina. Again, I want to thank the governor and specifically the North Carolina Department of Transportation for tackling this important issue, as we have now almost equalized transportation emissions with energy emissions in the state. As mentioned in previous presentations, we know that transportation emissions are cross-cutting and that ozone tailpipe emissions from fossil fuel vehicles is formed at greater rates with increased heat and sunlight. Reducing transportation emissions is critical, and not by only changing engine types. We have heard that the transportation and pollution emissions impact people of color, low wealth populations disproportionately. Proximity to emissions and vulnerability to mobile source pollution are exponentially impacted when vehicle or clean vehicle ownership is not a transportation solution, and reliance on active and public transportation become vital to economic and social mobility. We hope that Executive Order 80 will expand to include these communities more clearly and address these types of infrastructure disparities more directly. In this tragic grand experiment we are in, not since the invention of the internal combustion engine have we seen more clearly the impact of elimination of mobile source emissions from the transportation sector. As our annual air quality averages require 3 years to create, the improvements to air quality from the last 100 days will be evident for years to come and are clearly defined in air quality reports across the state's monitoring network. We hope that the governor and this Executive Order 80 process will expand the initial request of the state to embrace fleet change and improve the access to renewable energy sources for transportation across the state. But we are eager to see Executive Order 80 embrace the goals of reducing vehicle miles traveled by investing in active and green transportation rather than solely new road building, to codify complete streets, and to open transportation funding to support active, resilient transportation choices. Specifically, we hope that the governor and Executive Order 80 will do more to increase the non-highway projects and investment goals to reflect major reductions in emissions outlined in previous mitigation efforts.
Thank you, sir. Your time has expired. Maple Osterbrink. Maple Osterbrink. Yes, I can hear you. Go ahead, please.
Can you hear me?
Start your comment. Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Hear me? I'm clicking it because I didn't. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. I'm not used to this format, you know. Okay. Yeah, my name's Maple Osterbrink. I live in Chapel Hill. I'm a member. I'm a volunteer. And I'm fighting. I am a volunteer with NC Warren as well as to protect the people and places we live, which was a lot fighting the ACP. I'm really glad to hear Jeremy Tarr, who met me on the street. We were doing against the water permit for so we're really glad that has been beat by many for street there. I'm glad meeting. I went to that. It's good. In our groups that were fighting everything. Now we can love Steve Buchanan's group, the stewards. It's awesome for getting together all the protection and the habit. She's on track with that and her because our forests are wetlands, and I'm glad to see alerting us to the fact that the sequestration, right? So we've all been in those islands. Some, and Viva has taken these people to not sell off their forests. What else? Crazy that is, but it goes. Permits. I appreciate him doing the and trying to do what is possible. Stop the bad things as soon as possible because this is an emergency. I'm scared every day, including week.
Thank you, ma'am. Your time has expired.
But we need gas. To stop the gas is what I mean and do.
Thank you for your comment. And I wanted to go back and see if Belinda Joyner was able to join us. She was also signed up to speak. Belinda Joyner. All right. And Andrea Geller. And last call for Susan Hulbert. That concludes everyone we had listed to speak. As we have a moment left, there was one request in the Q&A from Hannah Williams to provide a comment. Matthew, is it possible to unmute Hannah Williams?
She should be unmuted.
All right, please go ahead with your comment. Hannah? Okay, we don't seem to be able to hear you. In that case, Sushma, that concludes the public engagement section. If you had anything else to say, otherwise we can close the meeting.
Thank you so much, Sharon, and thank you for the commenters. We will take into account your suggestions and your ideas and work towards incorporating that into our work areas. I wanted to, with a few minutes left, allow any of our cabinet agency designees or program staff, if they'd like to say anything, please unmute yourselves or let Matthew know if you'd like to speak. So the executive designees, is there anything you'd like to add or say anything before we adjourn? Okay. And any of the program staff, if you would like to say anything, put that in the chat box and we'll unmute you. Well,
Sushma, this is Jeremy. I just wanted to mention, in case folks hadn't seen the announcement in mid-July, that the governor signed on to the medium and heavy duty zero emission vehicle MOU, joining 14 other governors and the District of Columbia in that program. The upshot is that the MOU kind of commits to a goal that all sales of medium and heavy duty vehicles will be zero emission by 2050, 30% by 2030. To get there, the MOU state participants are on a task force, and that task force is developing an action plan. DOT and DEQ are North Carolina's representatives on that task force, with the Department of Commerce supporting. So if folks have, if that is a topic of interest to folks, over the next couple of months, feel free to reach out directly to DOT or DEQ on that. If you need a contact, feel free to reach out to me or Sushma as well.
thanks, Jeremy. So it doesn't look like anyone else has asked for an opportunity to speak. So we will adjourn. Just a heads up that December, we will coordinate with you all regarding the December meeting. Let us know what ideas you have. And until then, stay safe and have a good day.